So Boris Johnson this week was giving testimony over 2 days to the COVID inquiry. I'm not convinced that we actually learnt much. He was grilled on everything from the decision behind every lockdown. He was asked about Barnard Castle on the day that we were talking about it, the scandal of Dominic Cummings testing his eyesight, as people might remember. He was asked about the gender balance of his top team, as to whether that was helping him or hindered him from making the correct decisions. I mean, look, what have you made of this inquiry? It just doesn't seem to be asking the questions that most people would want answered, which is, was lockdown a good idea, and how can we stop it from happening again?
Well, absolutely right. I mean, starting with Boris, I think he made a relatively good account of himself under very difficult circumstances. He talking about, the key thing that was publicised was his apology for not locking down sooner, broadly. But he gave a good account of that, saying he weighed up the arguments in favour and against. And of course, it's worth remembering that the UK has performed quite well in terms of its overall COVID response. Compares very well to some other countries in Europe, not as well as some others like Sweden, who never had a lockdown.
Yeah.
But we did okay. And on the inquiry more generally, I think Boris's evidence and the evidence we've heard from Dominic Cummings, so much of it has been completely tangential to the important questions that this inquiry should be asking, which is what we should do if a virus like this ever hit again. I mean, that is what an inquiry is for. It's to establish procedures and perhaps regulations and additional laws to manage a situation where something like this happened again. Now, query whether anything like COVID will happen again in the way that it has before. So query whether anything this inquiry could come up with will provide us with any kind of meaningful defence. But that's at least what they should be purporting to be doing. But so much of this questioning has been about toxic cultures within Number 10. It's been about WhatsApps. It's been about the rude language used by Dominic Cummings to describe the Prime Minister. All of it has been
How many women work in Number 10 came up as well, all this sort of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And you just get the sense that what is being played out is this sort of Islington dinner party critique of the way that COVID was handled.
Yeah.
In a really public, performative way. And, this is costing £1 million a week and it's going to last a very, very long time. So I think the British public will get to a point where they say, well, what questions are really being asked here? What relevance does some of this questioning have? And I think they'd be right to ask it. I think, anyway, I think in general, public inquiries are only useful in as much as they provide concrete suggestions for what we should do in light of what we've experienced. And so far, this inquiry is getting nowhere near that.
Yeah, I mean, Tom, talking to just the sort of distractions from the inquiry, it was interesting that, day one, they asked about Brexit. They are planning to, Hugo Keith Casey has promised he will do something on race as well, just in case people were worried about that. Yeah. What do you make of that? I mean, it's just... It's just somewhat everything wrong with the political class to me.
No, exactly. And it's how trivial these people are. I mean, the whole thing, as Luke was laying out there, has kind of felt like a mammoth episode of the Newsagents podcast in terms of the sort of talking points that are being regurgitated in terms of how little light is being shone on what should be the proper questions, and also how ill-informed this has been at various points. I mean, one of the big set two moments of this week, of course, Hugo Keith, the KC, suggesting that the UK had one of the worst excess death records in all of Europe. Boris Johnson, surprisingly, over his over his brief that day, suggesting that's obviously not true. We're very much kind of like middle of the pack in terms of developed countries. The KC then having to wheel back. He's also allowed various people who, advisors and so on, who clearly did a screeching U-turn early on in the pandemic. He didn't really hold those people to account whatsoever. As long as they were saying something along the lines of, we should have locked down earlier, and I've got some diary entry here which indicates such, he was just letting them get away with it. So the lack of seriousness is quite pronounced, and because it's so unserious, it's just been, the gap has been filled by all of these ridiculous sorts of talking points. You would think that they've basically decided that the perfect policy is the one that we almost pursued, i.e. just like you would have locked down really hard, really early, and then everything would have been absolutely fine. Presumably they still think we should have kept the schools closed, whatever. You just wonder, what country do you want to point us to that did an absolutely wonderful job of this? Do you want to point to the countries in the east of Europe, which locked down very early on and very hard, and then saw their numbers roar back up again, and as a consequence experienced a hell of a lot of excess deaths at the end of all of this? Also, we've heard a lot about the COVID families, the families of the COVID bereaved and so on. But what about the obvious physical, mental impact that has been wrought by lockdowns. And this has not really featured apart from as a kind of aside so far. But I think the most depressing thing about it is I would be surprised if anyone thought that this wasn't how it was going to go.
Yeah.
Because the script for it had essentially been written by the great and good from the off, I guess.
Yeah, and you mentioned Sweden and its lack of excess deaths. It's like I'm sure I've not heard the country named once. You'd think that's any sensible person would think that's the model: the most freedom, the less deaths. Where's the downside? But apparently not, according to this inquiry. And it was interesting. There was a really fascinating moment with Michael Gove the other week. I don't know if people saw this, where he's sort of raised the spectre of a lab leak. He suggested lots of intelligent people are telling me that this virus might have come from a laboratory. And Hugo Casey shuts him down immediately, says, that's not part of the remit of this inquiry. And you're thinking, but everything else is part of the remit of this inquiry. The gender balance of Boris Johnson's team is part of the remit of this inquiry. It's going to look into education. Devolution is part of the remit. Yeah. Boris was being grilled on earlier today. Why didn't you have enough meetings with Mark Drakeford? The role of Dominic Cummings, presumably Brexit is part of the inquiry, but not the actual origins of the virus.
Yeah.
Tells you everything you need to know.
Basically, yeah. I mean, it's just despairing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you said it all. I mean, so he's talking about the terms of reference. So at the outset of every inquiry, the terms of reference are set, meaning these are the questions that we're going to look at. And they're, in this inquiry, unprecedentedly long. There's reams and reams of it. But as you say, none of the questions that might be resolvable by an inquiry like this. This inquiry could look and propose a serious evidential consideration of how the virus came to be in the country, and that would necessarily involve some scrutiny of the various theories around how it came to be. But no, we don't get that. I think it's worth just saying how extraordinarily emotional some of this inquiry has been as well. So much of the emphasis has been on the emotion of the pandemic. It began with a sort of film about the survivors and those who had passed away, and obviously to some extent quite rightly, the families of those who had passed away have been present in the room. But this follows a trajectory for public inquiries in recent decades where the focus has been more on seeing to give some kind of emotional payback for the people who have suffered. The idea that you are doing some form of justice to them. And I think necessarily politicians, I think the political actors in this have emerged relatively well, because they are able to say, well, look, it's all very well questioning me like this in hindsight, with a view to giving some kind of emotional placation to the people who were affected. But put yourself in the room, put yourself in a position of power where you do have to make decisions about how to, closing down an entire economy with the consequent economic harm that causes. Actually, these decisions shouldn't have been rushed into. And of course, had they rushed into them, we might be criticizing them from the other end of the scale. So there is some, the kind of what you would call the cross-examination process has arguably put those decision makers in a positive light, because they are being asked about this from a position of hindsight, which no one would expect them to have at the time.
Yeah, definitely. Tom, anything else you want to add?
On that point about the emotionalism, I think is dead on, because of the fact that it's also an expression of the kind of tilt and the bias of the inquiry, not to be, unsympathetic about this. Because if you had a 15-minute video about all the people whose lives were destroyed by lockdown, whose teenage son commits suicide after months of isolation and poor mental health problems, that would also feel like a strange slant to put on what is supposed to be a kind of objective discussion. So I see that very much as an expression of the fact that the narrative was set from even before the inquiry actually began. And but nevertheless, you would just hope there was some more emphasis put on the cost of lockdown, because of the fact that controlling a virus is something that isn't really in a minister's gift. They can try and mitigate the worst effects of it. They can try and protect the vulnerable as best they possibly can. They can do certain things to try and make sure that we weather the storm as best as possible whilst also not destroying the economy. But the one thing that they could definitely have done is not lock down, is not close the schools. Those are decisions that they are responsible for and that had never been done before. And yet the lack of scrutiny, curiosity as to whether or not that was the right thing really is striking, even if we did expect all of this to play out as it has.